Greetings, traveler.
Alright guys, I have a treat for all the early birds. We are going to start out with a patch review. But this one put a little bit more effort into, well, quite a bit more effort into than we usually. I actually took a look at the patch beforehand, right? I'm not going to be just reading it on stream. And there's some more production value, so let me get that set up and then we'll get started. So I'm gonna obviously go over the actual changes, but I'll try to give a little bit of a reasoning behind it and also what it means for the meta, right? 1 second, guys. Let me, can't hear my daughter in the background. I'm gonna redo this. Leave this in the YouTube video. Alright guys, so we're gonna start off with the removed cards. The reason that these cards are out for me is basically just we need space to add new stuff. So nothing too fancy. Don't have to spend too much time on this. Then we have the added cards. Mana Saber, Rat Pack. These are just token support. So my assumption is that beasts were really underperforming. So a lot of the time when we look at a patch, we look at it through the, okay, what data do the developers have? Because a lot of the time, these changes are going to reflect what data they have. So for instance here, beasts are really getting destroyed. They're not doing much. Okay, we need to make beasts better. How do we make beasts better? Let's add some token support. So having Mana Saber and Rat Pack in the game, that helps with Hummingbird, that helps with Dread Stomper, just anything that benefits from getting extra summons. And we know from experience that if you start with Mana Saber on turn 1 and then open Hummingbird on turn 3 when you're on tier 2, that is just going to make your early game a lot smoother, a lot better, a lot stronger. And then it's also a bit easier to go into Beast afterwards. Doesn't mean you can just start with this and then transition into anything else, but it is nice to have. Then Little Rag is really hard to gauge because that's this used to be a 6-drop that then because of power creep became a 5-drop that then because of power creep is now a 4-drop. So this was actually a thing people used to do. You used to rush to tier 6 and get Little Rags. And you would play Genie with Little Rag and that would win lobbies. That would scale. But a good comparison here is when we think about Little Rag is what does Rock do, right? So if I have Rock on my board and I play a Elemental, I'm gaining plus 14 attack. If I have a Little Rag on my board and I play a Elemental, I gain +2/+2 on something. Right. So that's the level of power creep we're talking about. Now, obviously, Elemental is a 2-drop, so it's not quite as good. But let's say Tavern Tempest, that would be probably your premium thing to play. That's +4/+4 somewhere, and then another Elemental. So this one, for me, is going to be a little harder to gauge because it's possible that there's some strategy where you're on 4 and you're collecting some extra Little Rags, and it ends up being something that is viable and actually even quite strong. But if you look at it through the lens of how elemental comps are being played right now, with the Golden Wraith making you quasi-infinite with the Rocks and the Bran, there's probably not that much room to fit Little Rag because it's not like Rock was removed, it's not like Wraith was removed. So I will experiment with this for sure myself, but right now my instinct is that I wouldn't really change how I play elementals even though this is in. So we'll see. Yeah, I don't know if this is going to be the case for very long, but at the moment it seems like Rat Pack and Little Rag aren't in yet. So there might have been a little bit of an error in the patch, but obviously we assume that's going to be fixed rather fast, right? Right? Card changes. Rylak was changed from trigger the left minion to trigger an adjacent minion. So what that means is it will still only do one minion, but it can be on the left or on the right. The funny thing is that there's actually a dev comment here that people were frustrated that their duo partner did not realize that the Rylak wasn't triggering. So imagine you're playing duos, you feed your teammate a Rylak, you feed your teammate the Golden Jazzer, you sit there rubbing your hands being like, our gems are gonna be so big. It's like, he's got it on the wrong side. He's getting 0 value. He did it again. I'm pinging. What the fuck? We lost. That's actually a thing that happened enough that the devs were like, okay, let's make it either side. It's fine. It's fine. I mean, in terms of power level, this is a small buff because now you can put Rylak first and kill off the Rylak and still trigger the battle cry. Before the change, you couldn't put the battle cry first because the battle cry would suicide and the battle cry would have to be on the left-hand side. So the Rylak would actually have to be either in the middle or in the back, usually in the back, which can be a little bit annoying because if you have multiple taunts, you might not get the value, right? Or if you're fighting a ghost, it's harder to guarantee the value if you have to put the Rylak in the middle or in the back. And then there's also the small case where you can now put a battle cry in the middle and play 2 Rylaks. That's not super strong, but that's now possible because of this change. Otherwise, you can't put a battle cry to the left of both Rylaks. That doesn't work. So mainly quality of life here change. Unlike this one, this is not a quality of life change. This is a very, very big change to how the game works. I'll start off by just saying what changed. Pokey Thornmantle got buffed. Look at the stats. He's now a 6-7 instead of a 4-5. That's huge. No. That's a small compensation that Blizzard gives to Pokey for the text change. Pokey now triggers at the start of turn instead of the end of turn, which means that it does not work with Drukhari anymore. And this was really one of the biggest things you needed if you were playing Pokey. You want to get a Drukhari as fast as possible, because what does Drukhari do? It triggers off your Murkai. If you have a Gem Smuggler, it triggers your Charlie. It's just fantastic. I will say that at the highest levels of play, and my level, just the distinction that it's not the highest. Pokey was not really a problem because the game was so fast that people were playing mech, people were playing dragon, and honestly, the super high-end builds were Golden Wraith and just APM elemental stuff. Pokey was actually really rare because it's so slow to get. Because what do you need? You need a 6-drop. And that's already hard to do in a meta where everybody is just smashing each other in the face. Because if you were going to take a 6-drop instead of a 4-drop, which a lot of people were doing, they were taking a 4-drop, try to get Chimera, try to get Long John, just get something to get the board in fighting shape earlier. You take a ton of damage if you go for a 6. And then after you find the Pokey, you still need to hit the Drukhari, etc. So I will say at very high MMR, this wasn't really dominant. I do think the lower you go, right, if you start to get the mid levels or low levels of MMR, this becomes much stronger because there's going to be less pressure. And in duos, this was very likely the strongest thing you could do after they nerfed Orchestra, because in duos it's very easy to feed your teammate the Pokey early, or to feed your teammate that has the Pokey the Drukhari and then feed them all the other stuff. So it's probably still healthy for the game that it's nerfed, because for duos it's really important that this is not just a monster build that you have to play every single time Poolbor are in. And I think for the general player base it's also a decent nerf, but again, at the highest levels of play, not that relevant. But we'll see, right? I don't know if we're... So one thing you do have to keep in mind is, yes, this makes Pokey a lot slower and worse, which might say, oh, now you never play it at high MMR, but they're also going to make other changes. So we have to assume that due to those other changes, maybe now Pokey is still viable, right? But we'll cover everything else. So let's go to the next one. So Party Elemental, right? The idea I get here is that elementals need help according to Blizzard, because this is sort of a, hey, let's start to make elementals stronger. Like, let's give them a little bit help in the early game. Similar to Hummingbird, Mana Saber, they're now saying, oh, let's make Party Elemental a little bit stronger. We're going to see a change to Molten Rock as well. So to me, that indicates that Blizzard has stats where elementals are underperforming. So let's see how if that trend continues, right? But we are changing Party Elemental from giving a 1-1 buff to a 2-1 buff. So that's a big deal. Jet Stomper here going from a 2-6 to a 4-11, right? That is massive. So that Stomper going from 2-6 to a 4-11, that is a huge stat change, which you might say, does that even do anything because the effect doesn't change? Yes, it does a lot, because the chance that your Dead Stomper now gets sniped when you play it on the first turn is a big deal, right? This is a big deal. This to me is also very telling, because Death Stomper was actually fine at higher MMR because it was a good counter into dragons, into mechs. So if you play Mech Horse and like a Reborn Raptor and you play Death Stomper, that would actually do pretty damn well against a lot of good meta builds. Like you have dragons, you have mechs with a lot of divine shields. So that is scary that they're buffing this so much. Again, Probably their stats indicated that beasts were in the gutter, which is true, right? But Death Stomper isn't really beasts. It's sort of a different archetype. It's more, you can play some undead with this, with resummons, you can play other stuff. So to me, this is a little scary for higher MMR that, you know, this might just be some nasty, nasty tempo card. We're going to take so much damage. But we'll see how it plays out. But that's definitely a card that's a little scary for me. Whirling Lassomatic going from a 9-5 to a 7-4. That to me makes perfect sense because Lasso with Serena was a really easy to play and very strong combo. So this is not going to kill the combo at all. But it's good that it gets a little bit of a stat bump, like just, you know, in the different direction, just bump it down a bit. I don't know if that's going to be enough because especially if they're going to be nerfing a lot of other stuff, this is still strong. Lasso plus Serena, right? Because you're losing 2 attack and 1 health. That 2 attack is made up once you play 1 spell. So we'll see if in the next patch they have to nerf this combo a bit further because it's just it's so easy to play. It's so strong. Scrap Scraper goes from being a 5-5 Battle Cry and Death Rattle to a 6-5 just Death Rattle. Whoo, that is a huge nerf. Like, oh my lord, is that a huge nerf. So this thing is now way weaker if you play it on the first turn because you don't get the magnetic straight away. That was why Scrap Scraper was a really solid pickup before. You would play it, you would Battle Cry, get a magnetic, and then you would straight away be strong and then also have a good effect. Now it's a 5-drop where you have to wait and get a Death Rattle effect if it dies. That is bad. So that's a huge nerf, which I suppose makes sense because mechs were probably destroying everything. Wasn't this an original form? Yep. And nobody played it. No, it used to be a 4-drop, right? It used to be a 4-drop and then they changed utility drone to tier 4. So, which meant Scrap Scraper had to go to 5, and then they buffed it to have Battle Cry, and then that was too strong, and then they removed the Battle Cry. Now, you used to be able to play this with Bran, and then you would get Draconic with the Trigger Battle Cry, you would get the Dreamer's Embrace on the Battle Cry, so there's so much stuff you could do with it. So, yeah, this, I mean, it's a good change in terms of the meta because mechs were dominant. We have to see if the tempo slows down a bit because part of the reason why the tempo of the game is so high is of the high quality 3 and 4 drops, and I don't think that changes that much in this patch. So again, we're going to finish the patch and then sort of circle back to the idea of, you know, are mechs still a problem or not? Yeah, speaking of strong force, Chimera is really warping the meta. The reason why you want to level to 4 ASAP is because Chimera exists, and there's a couple other 4-drops that are really good, like Long John, and early game Aranasi is also a super strong. But now they're changing Chimera from a 1-5 to a 1-6, so like what the hell are they doing? They're making it stronger. But they're changing it to 1-1 twice per combat instead of 3 times per combat. That to me probably still feels pretty good. We're going to have to experiment a little bit with it because it's always possible that something at face value, right, at the surface level still sounds pretty good and it's actually a significant enough nerf that we're like, ugh, we don't like it. Especially if you can get 2 of these on the board, that's still very strong because I remember a lot of my Chimera fights, I'm not really getting full value anyway. Like, it's not super common that I'm getting the 3 hits every time. You could argue that if you're only getting 2 procs anyway, it's actually a bit of a buff on the stat line, right? Now, overall, it's a big nerf, right? Don't get me wrong, it's a big nerf. My thing that I'm thinking about right now is, was Chimera so insanely good that this is still a very powerful card on +2/2 instead of +3/3? And my instinct is yes. That's what I'm feeling right now. My instinct is that this went from something that was batshit crazy broken to just really good. Again, we'll have to try it out. I'll play it and I'll be doing sort of a follow-up on this patch review where I'll do a little bit of a meta report where I'm talking about everything. Okay, now that I've played with it, this is how I feel about it. But for now, I'm going to say still good, right? Still a good card. Crooner going from a 4/4 to a 2/2. That does make sense. Crooner was not being played at all. And the developers were like, well, you're going to play Crooner whether you like it or not. So we're going to move Crooner to be a 3-drop. And we're going to make it a 4-4. Why does it matter that it was a 4-4? Because this is a common thing where people look at it and be like, whether it's a 2-2 or a 4-4, it doesn't matter. You buy Crooner for the effect, right? Not the stat line. The difference is you pick up Crooner more often if it's a 4-4 because you look at your shop and you compare what one card does versus another. If you have Deep Blue at a 4-4, that means it's a 5-5 on the turn you buy it because you get +1/+1. If you compare a 5-5 on the turn you buy it, plus the upside of it being stronger in the subsequent turns, that means you're going to pick Crooner just because of tempo reasons over, say, you know, like a random, like let's say a Divine Shield on tier 3. You could argue that when you have like a Pharynx in the shop and a 5-5 Crooner, you're saying like, well, I could take the Crooner here and then I have a buff and the next turn I get a bigger buff. And then maybe I roll into Zeddy and I can play that. Whereas if you pick Crooner as a 2-2, you are now getting a 3-3 for your fight. And now you have to really make a sacrifice where you say, I'm going to choose to be weaker for several turns compared to buying, say, that Pharynx. So that's a good change if Crooner was overperforming. It was a little bit too easy to pick it up. So now you're just going to see less Crooners early because it's not just going to be the best card in the shop. Now you're going to actually have to sacrifice strength on the turn where you buy it. This is a very interesting change. So Seafarer goes from after you buy 4 cards to after you buy 3 cards. When it was in this form, it was broken on release. The issue is why I don't think it's going to be necessarily broken is that we're in a meta where we have lots of high damage Divine Shield. So it's tough to just get pirates off the ground. You need to imagine that if you build a board of just the good minions, but they don't have Divine Shield, they don't have like Death Rattles and stuff, it's just dudes. It's just like, you know, Seafarer and Tethys and, you know, other pirates. You get farmed by Deflectobots, by high damage Divine Shield dragons. It's just cards that don't do anything on top of their stat line. They give you an effect for value, but they don't do that well in the combat. Seafarer was a thing when it was 4 cost, when Nala was like a common strategy before the patch. Right now, Nala is still something you can play, but it's not really with Seafarer. It's usually with Shell Whistler and trigger the Shell Whistler over and over because that seems easier than playing it with Seafarer. There also used to be that dragon end of turn, give you 2 spells. That was a pretty cool comp with Nala. But right now, this is going to be an interesting thing for me to try because does this card suddenly at 3 cards become good enough that you can play it in the face of these high damage Divine Shield boards? Or is it still going to be too slow or you're still going to end up dying? So that's where I'm at. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But in a different meta, on spell release, this was broken with buy 3. So I will definitely try it. And, you know, if you're hearing this right now, then, I mean, you should probably at least give it a go. Because, again, right, this was really, really good. This was nerfed for a reason. It's very good at 3. All right, and we can see that trend of pirate support continuing here. Your courier goes from a 2/6 to a 1/6, but it now buffs every 4 gold instead of every 5 gold. The big buff there is that if you're gonna run it in a full pirate comp, you're gonna get way more attack in the long run. This card is a little bit worse to just pick up in isolation right now because you starting off with a 1/6 can be the difference between taking damage that turn if it were a 2/6, because a 2/6 is significantly better than a 1/6 on the turn you play it. So it's more a card you really want to build around if you're, you know, if you're going to go full pirates, which makes sense, right? It's a pirate card, so the fact that it's now a little bit worse standalone doesn't necessarily matter. It's better to just buff it for its intended composition, which is just having a full pirate board. This is like a very small change. This to me is also telling, where they looked at their stats and they were like, when people play Sister, they're winning a little bit too much. So let's go from a 4/10 to a 5/9, where I guess, is a 5/9 even necessarily yeah, it's a nerf because you just care about the HP on the Sister so it doesn't die. But I don't know. It's such a weird, yeah, I don't care. After friendly minions, the text is exactly the same, right? Oh no, it says minions. Wait. Hold up, turn around. Redo. What the hell? Okay. What the fuck is this? It says minions. Dude, I was looking at the words. So I was like, after a friendly minions. What the hell is this? Wait, is that broken? That's broken, right? How do you break this? Wow. It's got to be a way to break this where it's too good. You go like reborn, handless, hag. Yeah, my cat's here. Sorry. It buffing everything is a massive buff. Well, how do you, like, what is there that you can normally not buff that you can now all of a sudden buff with Sister? Wow. Okay, there's definitely some stuff here. My instinct is that I look at this and there's a way to break it. There's a way to make it like really nice. Titus, yeah. Titus getting scaling, that'd be good for sure. Wow, that's like a very brave change by the developers. But they're like, you know, let's just make this all minions. What's the worst that can happen? Definitely something to look at. That's big tempo now if you triple into this. All right, talking about big buffs. Holy crap. Lasher goes from an 8-3 to a 5-3. They changed it from +1 health to +1/1. Woo! That is a huge buff, which is necessary because I usually made the joke that if I rolled a Lasher in my shop, I would just have 1 fewer minions. I could have 3 Lashers in my shop and I would probably just roll past it. Like on 9 gold, I don't give a shit. I can make a golden Lasher, that's bait. Get out of here. There were definitely moments where you could make a board where you have Lashers on your board and it does okay and you're kind of getting by. But yeah, that's a massive, massive buff. It's going to be coupled with the next buff, right? But I do want to just state that I definitely want to try beasts now, and I don't know if they're nerfing other stuff, is this going to just be way too good? This might feel really bad if you're fighting someone with Lashers early now. Lasher seems like a tempo tool, but not a build around. I think you can build around this. I think you can take consistent second places, probably. If you have Lasher with the Ox, right? The 3-drop, the 8/8. You can have the 8/8 that damages your whole board. You can have the Reborn that damages your whole board. I've definitely seen people play Lasher to some proficiency before the buff. But it really requires you to run something like Titus and then Macaw and then trigger the death rattle of the thing that deals damage to your whole board over and over and over and over again. You really want to go all in on this self-damage tool because when you have Skyblazer on your board as well, you're double dipping so hard. So if your backline is Lasher Skyblazer, you can have stuff like Macaw and then the Beast with the Reborn Death Rattle. You can even have something like a Fire Dancer to deal damage. You can have a Titus to stack that thing. You can Reborn the Macaw to go off again. You can have a Golden Macaw, which triggers it twice. There's so much potential to all of a sudden really go, you know, your board just goes like, it's just damage. And then Lasher is just like, just goes up like crazy. Especially with the Skyblazer now giving +1/+2 instead of +1/+1, which is good, right? Because beasts were unplayable before this, at least at high MMR. So I like that they're essentially saying, okay, you know what? It's unplayable. Here you go. Now it's really strong, or at the very least, we've made the cards way better. And then if it's too strong, maybe they can dial it back. So we'll see. This is also a huge change, by the way. Murky is now going from +10/+10 flat to +4/+4 for each friendly Murloc you control. It doesn't say each other friendly Murloc you control. So that means that you can have a board of 6 Murlocs with a Bran. 6 Murlocs, that's +24/+24. With a Bran, that's +48/48. We can, let's say 50/50 for easy math. You can now have a Golden Murky. Now you're triggering it twice. So you're getting 100/100. You can have a Golden Murky, 200/200. You could have 2 Murkies on the sides, 400/400. So yeah, obviously that's the high roll, but this makes me feel like it's old Murky because Murky before the nerf was +1/+1 for each battle cry played. Now, getting it started at 24/24 is not bad. It's not gonna go super crazy infinite buffs like it used to be back in the day when you had Golden Brand and you just cycled through so many battle cries. But this is good. This is a change where I think you can very easily glance over and be like, oh yeah, 4/4 per Murloc, that's kind of the same, I guess, right? But it's like, it's not, right? It's more than double. if you have 6 Murlocs. And it's very easy to have 6 Murlocs in a brand. The one downside is if you end on 6 Murlocs, the Murky can randomly buff your cycle slot. So there is an argument to just call it 2020 instead and just say I'll play 5 Murlocs a brand and then a random card to end on so that my Murky doesn't accidentally buff the Murloc I was going to sell anyway. Now, sometimes you know you're going to make a triple, so you get on a Murloc anyway, and then the triple bounces to your hand, and you can play it, and you did not waste any stats. So I think this is honestly fine to have 5 Murlocs on the board and make it a 20-20 buff, so a 40-40 if you have Bran. That's still really solid. Yeah, that's a big change in my opinion. That definitely makes Murlocs more viable when you have the buff comp instead of just the hand buff comp. So I still think you will prefer to play Primal Fin because Primal Fin is economy, but it's a bit harder to set that up, I think, because you need to have the Bream in your hand already, whereas you can transition into this a little bit easier. Anyways, we'll see. But it's nice to have a different way to play Murlocs now. Oh yeah, I mean, I guess a little thing is that there's now a nerf if you're buffing your Chimera with this. Good. Chimera was too strong. Next. A-Bomb from 1-1 to 1-2. I mean, that definitely makes it stronger if you want some high-level insights. Plus 1-2 is stronger than 1-1. The reason why I'm saying it like that is sometimes you can buff a card, but it still doesn't really push you in a good direction, so it's not a great thing to do. Now, I think now you're going to get more instances where you triple into an A-Bomb and you're like, you know what? Okay. Right? And then you put it down. And then there's a little bit more chance that you're going to have a board that accommodates this effect. So you're going to have Reborns. So now there's a little bit more chance you're going to play Sister. That's really what these buffs are all about. These buffs are more about, now it's more likely you pick up this card. And if you have this card on your board, you're more likely to play into it further. So now you're just more likely to do something like Death Stomper. You're more likely to do something like Sister. That's really the main goal of these buffs, right? To get you to play these types more. So yeah, I think, again, still at high level, the game is still a little bit too... Like, you scale too much when you're doing stuff like the elemental buffs, where something like an A-Bomb, it's not really going to be able to keep up. But we'll see, right? Molten Rock for a 3-3. Honestly, I mean, it doesn't matter that much, but... For me, it's scary that they think elementals are too weak because, again, right, elementals might be too weak across all MMRs, but at high level, elementals are super strong right now. So being able to pick up the Molten Rock a bit easier, being able to pick up the Party Elemental a bit easier, it's going to make it better for you to pick up Wraith, and Wraith is already insanely good at high MMR, so I don't love that there's these small subtle buffs to elementals. Same thing here, a not so subtle buff. Frostling is now a 5-drop instead of a 4-drop, but it goes to +2/+1 for each elemental you've played. This is a huge buff for when you're cycling elementals and you get Shelemental. There's actually something that happens so often where you're playing with your Golden Wraith, you play a Tavern Tempest, you get a Shelemental from the Tavern Tempest, and then you're just trying to find a big guy in the shop, and it's either going to be the Fungus, the one that scales with the spells, or it's going to be the Frostling, the one that scales with the elementals. And now that you have +2/+1, you're gaining twice as much damage every time you play a Shelemental. So that is sort of an indirect Shelemental buff, like quite a big one. Especially with a Golden Wraith, the chance that you find this is fairly high. Now it is a 5-drop, so there's fewer copies, but still you see so many shops, it's really not unreasonable to assume that you're going to find it for your Shelemental. Then Little Rag is now a 4/4 on tier 4 instead of a 6/6 on tier 5. We've already discussed Little Rag, right? It's difficult to imagine that this is competitive with Rock to me right now. So the only way I could see this suddenly being really good is if there is some essentially timing where you get this on tier 4 and then it's too early. And there's just a way where you can get lots of them on tier 4 and you can stay on tier 4. But it's the tough one is that there's a, like, they've moved the trigger battle cry to tier 5. When you compare it to Rock, you're playing Rock and you play 1 elemental, you're gaining 14 attack to your board. You have 1 Little Rag on your board and you play 1 elemental, you're gaining 1/1 up to 6/6 to a random minion. That's just nowhere near as good. That's sort of the problem. Now the fun thing is that you can stack lots of little rags because you have way more little rags in the pool than rocks. That's the idea here. So I think that's sort of the way that this can surprise me, where it's suddenly good or even meta warping, is if there is a strategy where you can just stay on 4. Now again, right, the one issue I see is that Tavern Tempest is a 4-drop, but Trigger Battlecry was moved to tier 5. Oh, you can use eyes on this. Yeah, that is true, but that's 6 gold though. You really don't want to be spending 6 gold if you have a Golden Wraith and you just want to roll. You'd have to get it from Panda. So what does your board even look like, right? Because if you want to play eyes, you got to be on tier 5. And once you're on tier 5, you could also just have Elise, Wraith, and find 6 drops. And then with the 6 drops, you could be running Grey Main. I'm super happy to just play this and try it out because I don't know right now. Again, my instinct is that the Rock variant is just way stronger. My instinct is that being on tier 5, having an Elise, pulling a bunch of 6 drops, playing with Bran, playing with Greymane, playing with Rock, and just getting a bunch of rolls from Golden Wraith is just super good. So there might be a place for this where you just stay on tier 4. But I think if you were going to level to 5, you're better off playing the other build. Next up, we have Roaring Rallier. Roaring Rallier is going from +2/+2 to +2/+1. This card was insanely strong and honestly is probably still really good. That's sort of a problem I have when I look at this card. It's now a 3/5 instead of a 3/4. And if a friendly dragon attacks, it gets +2/+1. That to me still feels really strong. I have trouble understanding how this was in the game at +2/+2, which is just crazy. This to me still feels like it's a very, very good buy when you have a dragon board. You get 2 of these guys early, it's still fantastic. I still think you're going to take a lot of damage fighting someone with Roaring Ralliers. This used to be one of the ways you could use to buff your dragons out of token range. What is the weakness when you play dragons? It's that you have very high damage for super low HP. So super low HP struggles versus tokens. Menace, Mech Horse, anything with Goldrin. I've had many of my boards have a Roaring Rallier and then 2 Poets on the board. So suddenly the health buff from the Roaring Rallier is now permanent with the Poet. And that meant that I was actually beating the people that were really hard counters to me, which is really frustrating when your opponent plays the hard counter and they lose anyway. It's not frustrating for you, it's frustrating for the opponent, of course. In that regard, they cut the health scaling in half. So that's very good. Because when you look at it, those mech horses, they don't give a shit if you have 50 damage or if you have 500 damage, right? Most of the time, the mech horse is going to be lower than 50 HP. So the amount of damage the Rallier gives is not that relevant. It's really about the health. Early on, the damage is super relevant, of course, because that's where it's going to allow your dragons to trade into almost anything. It's going to make Divine Shield dragons do really well, like a Poet. But later in the game, this nerf is super impactful because now it is just half the health. And I've had a lot of boards where I had a Roaring Rallier until the end of the game, just because it was really, really good at scaling the HP. So in that regard, it is a good nerf. But I still think this is really strong early. This is really the biggest nerf to dragons. They've moved Amber Guardian from a 3-drop to a 5-drop. You can't start to permanently Divine Shield your board early. That's a huge nerf, because right now the reason why dragons are so stupid is you can easily pick up an Amber Guardian on tier 3 or tier 4, and then the moment you roll a Poet, you are going to very, very likely be able to aim your Divine Shields, right? Either you have to sell a dragon or you play a second Poet or whatever you have to do. It's very likely you're going to get 1 free Divine Shield per turn. And then when you're done Divine Shielding your whole board, you just sell it. Now, what does that mean? If you can't guarantee your board full of Divine Shields, suddenly you just lose to 1 cleave. 1 cleave can kill 3 of your dragons. Because remember, you don't have a lot of health when you play dragons. The reason why dragons are so good is Nightbane with Poet. Nightbane with Poet means you get a lot of permanent attack on your Divine Shield minions. And you can essentially look at it as a board full of Divine Shield poisons, because if you have enough attack to one-shot anything your opponent has, which is very likely the case if you have 2 Nightbanes, because all that you need to happen is for 1 Nightbane to buff another Nightbane once or twice, and suddenly you're using Nightbanes that have over 100 attack each, and they're just buffing, and the Poets are like ×2 because everything is golden with the Yulon and all that. Remove Divine Shield from your board, and all of a sudden, a big Ghastgoiler can be a problem, right? You know, a good cleave is a big issue. This is a huge blow to dragons, which is good. I think dragons were really dumb. So especially at high MMR, it's going to make dragons probably too slow. That's my initial instinct here. I think playing at mid MMR, you know, like let's say we're talking 6,000 and under, I think this is still going to be really good because the lower MMR you go, the more time you have. So essentially what the play would be, let's say you're 6,000 and under, you can still start by getting Poet Nightbane and then just level to 5 and then add an Amber Guardian. Now, if you do that at higher MMR, you're just going to get your face bashed in by someone with Chimeras and Aranasis and whatnot. So it's just not going to be fast enough. At least that's my instinct, right? My initial opinion. But I'll definitely play it. I'll try it. And if you happen to be on tier 4 and you triple into Amber Guardian, it's still going to work because now you're adding +7/+7. So funny enough, in some cases, this is a pretty big buff because if you're on tier 4 and you happen to have Poet and you triple into this, now you're giving the +7/+7 buff permanently. But it's going to make dragons as a whole perform a lot worse. But for the person that triples into Amber Guardian and has Poet, it's actually better because now your Amber Guardian's way stronger. Which is funny how that works. All right, so Hooktail goes from a 2/5 to a 1/4. That makes sense. People were playing this with Divine Shields and Tavern Spells, so they're just making the stat line a bit worse. Fair, we don't have to spend too much time on it. It's a small nerf. It's just going to make it harder to pick it up because now it's a 1/4. You kind of need to pick it up in combination with a spell for it to be worth it. Trickster went from a 2/3 to a 3/3. People weren't buying enough Tricksters, I guess, and now it's better. Cool, right? That's not a huge buff, but it's definitely a lot better, right? It's going to win more fights on tier 2 now because an extra damage point is not irrelevant. Same with Ooze, it's now a 2/2 instead of a 1/2, right? We're not going to spend too much time on that. It's better, it's going to win more fights now. Yeah, don't buy this shit. All right. Yeah, you can't play demons, man. I don't know what MMR this is actually good because I don't really want to give the advice of never play demons, but on my MMR, I cannot run Weaver. I cannot. It's just bad because even if I end up playing demons, my whole goal is going to be to sell pretty much every demon except one big guy, and I'm just going to resummon it over and over with cultists, like Cultist and Macaw and Titus. Now, I guess the argument you can make is if you happen to have a Golden Weaver, you're going to grow your Floating Watcher more, but it's just so scary to start with Weaver. Now, something that has changed that is not insignificant here is your backstage security is now Battle Cry, deal 1 damage to your hero. I'm like, what? I get it though, because so many people were complaining that backstage security was so god awful, so useless. Get it out of my game. This is a disgrace to my shop. I should be getting a refund because Bob offered me this trash. And the devs are like, okay, you know what? We'll just make it insane. Because that's what it is now, in my opinion. This is now a 4/5 and you take 1 damage. So yeah, that's annoying that you have to take 1 damage. But guess what? If you lose the fight, you take 2 damage or more. If you lose the next fight, you take 3 damage. So that's 5 damage as a whole. Essentially, buying backstage security is like having a really good insurance policy. It's like, would you like to pay 1 HP to almost guaranteed not take 5 damage? That's a really good deal. So especially now that they've removed all economy units from tier 1 except Swabby, there's going to be some instances where you take Swabby because you still want to have that 1 extra gold to level faster. But there's now going to be a really good argument to just put backstage security on the board and say, either I'm going to fight someone else with a backstage and we're going to tie, unless of course it's someone like Alec here, right? Or they don't have a backstage and I'm going to deal 2 damage and then 3 damage next turn. And I've only taken 1 damage for the entire trade. So that's a really good deal. It's like a prisoner's dilemma, but you're getting a really good deal when you fuck over your buddy. It's like, you only have to go to prison for 1 day if you rat on him. What do you say, right? So you're like, you know what? I'll take the 1 damage. I'll go, right? Because theoretically, if everybody agrees to not buy backstage security, nobody has to take the 1 extra damage on turn 1. But do you trust your opponent to not buy a backstage security? I don't. I'm going to buy backstage security because I don't trust that my opponents aren't going to buy it. So I think that's just going to shape the meta where, well, shape the meta on turn 1, right? The turn 1 meta is going to be buy backstage. I don't really see why you wouldn't. It just doesn't make sense. It's way too good. Next up, we got Fire Dancer going from a 5-3 to a 6-3. That's just, again, right? That's like the ooze buff. That's like the demon buff. It's just a little bit better now. You win a little bit more fights early. Not a huge change at all. Okay, then this one is pretty significant for tier 2, right? Not significant in the game as a whole, but on tier 2. It now changes from gaining 1 health to gaining 1 health permanently. Now, what does that mean? That means if you gain any attack during the combat, this is now stronger. So Shipwright to me was already really good in certain situations where you had the access to gems, where you had the ooze and you could give it +1/+1, or any other way you're buffing it, like Hooktail, right? All those buffs that happen during the Tavern phase are permanent anyway. So having it now get buffed in the combat, it's gonna make Rip Snarl Shipwright shops huge. Like, that is a really high roll now. That's a good board because you're talking about a 2/5 that is gaining +3 attack. That's a good deal, right? That's a good board. You'll play that sort of even without the effect on the card. You would just play a 2/5 that turns into a 5/5 when it attacks. That's solid, right? That's fine. That's gonna win you fights. But now it'll be a 2/6 and then a 2/7 and then a 2/8, and then you have 2 Rip Snarls. That's 2 separate buffs. You get any other buff, so you can put this minion to 10 health pretty quickly in the right board. And then you have a 10 health minion gaining Rip Snarl damage. So, yeah, good. Strong tier 2. Reminds me a little bit more of something like a Hummingbird plus a Mana Saber start, where you're just like, okay, that's good. That's going to win me some fights. So similar here, Rip Snarl, Shipwright, you know, that's going to win me some fights. Which in a way is good because it makes tier 2 stronger, and that there's just going to mean that there's going to be more incentive to not power level to 3 and 4 just as fast. Now, if you get this on turn 3, it still allows you to level on turn 4. So that's probably going to be the Giga high roll, right? You get this on turn 3, and then on turn 4, you level for 5, and you get a 1 gold spell. Maybe it's a Lantern, you buff your Shipwright again, and then suddenly you're strong, and you can still level to 4 fast. So yeah, that's really the high roll. Fellblood goes from a 3/2 to a 2/1. I think that's good. This card was just nasty with if you get it early. Now, similar to Deep Blue, there is going to be more of an upfront cost you have to pay. So now you'll just be taking more damage for having this on your board. So I will probably not have this on my board too often with just how fast the game is. But in the right lobby, say mechs are in, say you already have the Flectobot, you buff the shop a little bit, you can magnetize, that's still worth. But I think just as a normal pickup, this is now going to be less worth for me. Only if I'm really specifically going to buff the shop for magnetics. Then we have Dealer going from a 4/4 to a 6/6. That just continues the trend of pirates were underperforming, so we are just going to bump up pirates a little bit. Some small buffs, nothing too crazy. It's just going to make it easier to pick up the Dealer as your triple, right? So let's say you have 3 minions you don't really love. Dealer was a card you're not like super in love with in this meta, but now as a 6/6, maybe you're gonna like sell 2 or 3 minions that turn. You're like, oh, that's a 9/9. Okay, let me take that, right? And then because you have a Dealer on your board, suddenly you have a target for Balladist, and now it's bigger, and now you have more chance you're gonna want Peggy and blah blah. So all these changes do is it's just gonna push you into the direction of the type that was too weak. It's not that this change on its own makes the Dealer insanely strong. It's just that now there's more chances for you to have a Dealer on your board, which means there's more chances for you to end up as pirates. Bream counter going from 3/2 to a 3/3. I think this makes perfect sense. This was essentially a change that should have happened right after quest meta ended, because I think the only reason Murlocs were OP during the quest meta is that the quests just played really well into what Murlocs wanted to do. So if you get extra end of turn triggers with a Murkai and a Primal Fin, suddenly you have a handful of Murlocs. If you get additional Battlecry triggers, same deal. So there were just a lot of quests that really made it so easy to pop off with Murlocs, which made Murlocs super dominant in the quest meta. But after the quests were done, I think that they should have just insta rebuffed this, because this was fine before quest meta, and it just broke during quest meta. So it's good that they change it now though, right? Because essentially I guess they wanted a little bit more data, so wait a little bit, see like, okay, how does Bream perform? Oh, it's garbage. Okay, let's buff it again. So yeah, +3/+3 is strong. So with the other Murloc support, this is, yeah, it's gonna make it easier to play Murlocs. This I don't quite understand, this change, because they're changing Begurgle from a tier 5 to a tier 4. And it's now buffing +2/+2 instead of +3/+3. If I play Murlocs, I'm never going to stay on tier 4, right? I'm never going to be like tier 4, let me just play Begurgles and buff my board, because that's always too slow. When you play Murloc, your goal is to get to Murkai Primal Fin or Murky Murkai. Pretty much one of those two, because if you don't have that, you don't have enough value generation to keep up with anything else. So the really big change to Murlocs was that Primal Fin Lookout was changed from a 4-star to a 5-star. Now that's not like necessarily undeserved, because it was an insanely good card and it comboed with Rylak and it's comboed with Draconic. Now that Rylak is a little bit nerfed, now that Draconic is on tier 5, there might be some room to put Primal Fin back on 4. I don't know if they're going to consider that, but essentially Begurgle on tier 4 to me does not matter at all. Sure, sometimes you're gonna have a way to triple Begurgle because you got it from a Tad and then you have one in your hand already and there's one more in the shop and you're like, oh, what the hell, I'll just triple it. And then you get a lot of tempo on your board and it's fine, and maybe you triple into Bran and all that. But for the most part, you don't want to be spending your money on this. You just want to get to Bran, Murkai, and then Primal Fin next to Murkai or Murky next to Murkai. So to me, this is something, at least at high MMR, this is not really relevant. Again, I don't know how it translates with lower MMRs where boards in general are going to be a little bit weaker. So you might be getting away with staying on tier 4 and playing Begurgles, but probably not. Conch, same story, goes from tier 5 to tier 4, but I wasn't really buying Conch for the most part because it's still, you know, it's 2 gold essentially for 2 random Murlocs, because when you play Conch, you pay 4, but then the 2 Murlocs you can sell immediately. Now, if that Murloc is Tad or Primal Fin, it's phenomenal. So there's definitely some high rolls, but you're still paying 2 gold for 2 Bream procs essentially. On average, that's not good enough. When you're playing Murlocs, you're going to be on tier 5 or tier 6. You're going to want to have your Bran. You're going to roll. You want to have Trigger Battlecry for your hopefully golden Primal Fin. You're going to want to just roll into more Corals if you're playing the hand buff variant, or you're going to want to roll into more Murky and Murkais if you're playing the board buff variant. So this is again a change where I think at high MMR, not that relevant, because to me this seems like they just want to encourage this stay on tier 4 and buff your Breams, right? So essentially give the players some support that's not Primal Fin on tier 4 so that you can make your Breams bigger on tier 4. Again, for high MMR that doesn't work in my opinion. That's going to be too slow. But it's possible again, right, that there is a strategy where you stay on tier 4 and that it works on most MMRs. You stay on tier 4, you have the Bream in your hand, and you play Cloning Conch, and now you're getting some buffs. But again, right, most of the time it's going to be too slow. Then Trigger Battlecry, we already mentioned it. It goes from tier 4 to tier 5. I think that's a healthy change. This thing was super, super good, and you could stay on tier 4 and use that to trigger your Tavern Tempest, and oh my god. Also, there's more tier 4 spells in the pool than there are tier 5 spells, so it was just a little bit too easy to go Giga Infinite with Tempest on your board and have a Golden Wraith giving you free rerolls. It was just so good, so that's a fair change in my opinion. Another fair change here, Scavenge for Parts used to cost 4, then they overbuffed it to 2, and now they're scaling it back to 3. That's fine, I think probably that's what it's supposed to cost. It's good, it's really good if you have Drukhari. It's in general just nice to support your Beatboxer, to support your utility drone. But at 2 gold, it was just so easy to buy. Whereas now, because it's 3 gold, you know, before on 2 gold, you could sort of just buy that and hope you hit utility drone. And it's not awful if you don't. Now you're paying 3 gold now to get 3 gold later. That's not a good deal, right? So gold now is worth more than gold later, because the gold now you can spend and not take damage, and the gold you can spend now probably also is gonna be worth more later, because it's gonna allow you to level, it's gonna allow you to get better cards right now, so like Bran, and you get more value, yada yada yada. So generally speaking, it's not a good deal to give away 3 gold now and get it back later. Now, before you would spend 2 gold to get 3 gold back in the long run, right? You're making a gold. Fair change. Plunder Seeker going to stealing a random card for each pirate rather than stealing 1 plus 1 for each pirate. So that's a pretty significant nerf. To me, this card did not feel crazy or anything. Maybe it's because Jeeve was staying on tier 4 with a million lubbers and playing this thing and being infinite. I don't know if that's what the problem is or not, but this is never... Honestly, when I'm APMing, I never ever have time for this thing. I just don't have the time for this thing, man. It's just like, I'll play it, but it's gonna like steal from the shop, and they're like, I don't have any hand space. Oh, I pulled another one. Oh my god, I can never spend all this money. So yeah, I think when you're playing pirates, that's still good to pull, of course. If you get it from a rodeo performer and you're not playing pirates, it could actually steal 0 cards. So before, it was actually pretty okay to get because it was just a very fancy lasso where it would steal 1 random minion. And you can make the argument, maybe I can buy a gambler from the shop, put the gambler on my board for free because it costs 3, sells for 3. And now I'm stealing 2 cards. So it was like, okay, what the hell? I'm playing a panda, I'll take the Plunder Seeker. Now it's just going to be less likely you're going to want to do that because if you don't have a pirate on your board, you steal 0 cards. I'm not too sure about this. This to me just doesn't feel that relevant because if I had a lot of pirates, it's with bonkers. If I don't have pirates, I'm probably not playing it anyway, so whatever. Alright guys, and that was it for the solo changes. Now we have some more duo changes, not a lot. So this is again a case, in my opinion, of sort of overkill nerf and then scaling it back. Orchestra used the buff +2/+2 for every trigger. Then they nerfed it to 2/1 and they changed it to play. What's the difference? Orchestra, when you play it, it has to actually come from your hand on the board. When you trigger it, you can use Trigger Battlecry spell, you can use Draconic, you can use Murka, you can use Rylak. There's tons of way to force more triggers. Now, changing it from trigger to play and putting 2/1 instead of 2/2 was like overkill nerf. So they just changed it back to 2/2. And I could honestly even see this becoming more than 2/2 in the future if this still doesn't perform. Because it's hard to play a bunch of orchestras, right? You need to use the portal, you need to use Well-Wisher to send this back to your teammates so you can pick it up, play it again. And then the other one is Banari Messenger, going from tier 4 to tier 5. That to me does make sense. One of the stronger things to do in duos is one person plays Manari Messenger with Rylak, and then the other player sends all the support to the Manari Messenger player. So what means that the shop becomes huge for both players. Then the other player starts playing Felbor and your shop is massive. So that's when that player tries to get his hands on his own Bran. And then once you have Bran with Felbor, you can do all kinds of funky stuff, like you play a panda that discovers spells, then you play Well-Wisher, you wish the panda back to your teammate puts the panda back in your hand, you play the panda again, you pull more spells, you get like a Trigger Battlecry from the panda, you proc it again. So I've made like over 10,000 attack Felbors with that strategy, where your one teammate is just a battery, just a pure buff engine, and then the other player just goes crazy on Felbors, where you just pop off. Because ideally that one player just has as many Felbors on the board as he can fit, plus Bran, and then you can even do like Bran Murkai with the panda to pull more spells. You could have Bran Rylak with the panda. There's definitely ways where you can just fill your hand up full with spells. And you have to imagine, if your shop is over 100, which is very possible if one player is being fed all the Manari Messenger stuff, it's not hard to imagine if you have multiple Felbors on your board and you start with 10 spells in your hand, that is probably a little broken if you're getting essentially plus 100 per spell you play if you have 2 Felbors. Pretty insane. All right, guys, that's my review. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please do make sure to, let me know, would you like to see more of this in the future? That always helps, because this is a little bit of extra work. We are going to have a follow-up on this where, let's say I've been playing for a week and a half or 2 weeks. We can go over like, okay, what were the predictions? How did it actually play out? What is some additional information I have learned after playing that I can convey to you guys? But yeah, the real thing to see for me is, are mechs still gonna dominate? Because you're still pretty well off going to tier 3 and tier 4 fast. And if you're going to do that, it's still going to be a very high tempo meta. So I don't know how much room there is going to be to triple into 6-drops like you used to. So we'll see. Lots of stuff to experiment with.